Chapter 7, first half. As soon as she walked out, he stood up, locked the door, untied the package of clothes that Resuming had brought and retired earlier that evening, and began to dress. Strangely enough, he suddenly felt complete calm. There was no sign of his recent feverish delusions or the paralyzing fear that had been haunting him lately. It was the first moment of a strange, abrupt peace. His movements were precise and purposeful. A solid determination showed in everything he did. Raskolnikov, muttering to himself, "Today, it has to be today." He knew he was still physically weak, but his intense mental focus gave him an internal strength and self confidence. He just hoped he wouldn't collapse in the street. Once he was dressed in the completely new clothes, he looked at the money on the table after thinking for a second. He shoved it into his pocket. It was 25 rubles. He also took all the copper change left over from the 10 rubles. Razumihin had spent on the clothes. Then he quietly unlocked the door, went out, slipped down the stairs, and peeked into the open kitchen. Nastasia was standing with her back to him, blowing into the landlady's tea urn. She didn't hear a thing. After all, who would have ever guessed he would go out right now? 1 minute later, he was out on the street. It was almost 8 o'clock, and the sun was setting. The air was just as suffocatingly hot as before, but he hungrily breathed in the smelly, dusty air. His head felt dizzy. A kind of wild, savage energy suddenly flashed in his feverish eyes and his thin, pale, sickly face. He didn't know or care where he was going. He had only one single thought. All of this must end today, once and for all, right now. I won't go back home until it's over, because I refuse to keep living like this. How would it end? With what? He had no idea, and he didn't even want to think about it. He forced the thoughts away. Thinking tortured him too much. All he knew, all he felt, was that everything has to change, one way or another. He kept repeating this to himself with a desperate, unshakable confidence and grit. Out of all habit, he walked toward his usual spot, the Haymarket. A dark-haired young man with a street organ was standing in the road in front of a small grocery shop, grinding out a deeply sad, sentimental song. He was accompanying a 15-year-old girl standing on the sidewalk. She was dressed up in an old, shabby skirt hoop, a cloak, and a straw hat with a bright red feather. Everything looked completely worn out. In a loud, somewhat pleasant voice that was correct and ruined from singing on the streets, she sang, hoping to get a copper coin from the shop. Raskolnikov joined the small crowd of listeners, pulled out a 5 kopeck piece, and dropped it into the girl's hand. She stopped singing instantly, right on a dramatic high note, yelled sharply to the organ grinder, "Come on!" and they both moved down to the next shop. Now Raskolnikov, speaking to a middle-aged man standing idly nearby, "Do you like street music?" The man stared at him, startled and confused. Raskolnikov, continuing in a creepy, intense way that didn't match the casual topic. "I love hearing a cast has pale, sickly faces, or even better, when wet snow is falling straight down and there is absolutely no one. You know what I mean? And the street lamps shine right through it." Now the stranger, muttering in fear, freaked out by the question, and Raskolnikov quickly crossed to the other side of the street to get away from him. Raskolnikov walked straight ahead and reached the corner of the Haymarket, the exact spot where the street vendor and his wife had been talking to Lizaveta before. But they weren't there now. Recognizing the place, he stopped, looked around, and spoke to a young guy in a red shirt who was standing blankly in front of a grain shop. Raskolnikov, isn't there a man who runs a market booth with his wife on this corner? Now, young man in red shirt, looking down his nose at Raskolnikov, all kinds of people run booths around there, around here. Now, Raskolnikov, what's his name? Young man in red shirt, whatever name he was baptized with. Raskolnikov, are you from the Zaraski region too? Which province? The young man stared at him again. Now, young man in red shirt, it's not a province, Your Excellency. It's a district. Forgive me, Your Excellency. Raskolnikov, is that a tavern up there at the top? The young man in red shirt, yes, it's an eatery. There is a billiard room, and you'll find some princesses in there too. Raskolnikov walked across the square. In that corner, there was a thick, dense crowd of poor peasants. He pushed his way right into the middle of them. Studying their faces, he felt a strange, unexplained urge to talk to people. Now we have to wait 20 seconds here, look 20 feet or more away at them. So bear it. Now, but the peasants completely ignored him. They were all shouting and taking in their own groups. He stood there, thinking for a moment, then took a right turn toward V Street. He had often crossed this narrow, angled street that connected the marketplace to the Saddleway Street. Lately, whenever he felt deeply depressed, he felt pulled to wander through this specific neighborhood just so he could feel even more miserable. Now he walked along, his mind completely blank. In this area, there was a massive block of buildings filled entirely with cheap bars and eateries. Women were constantly running in and out, bareheaded and wearing only their indoor clothes. Here and there, they gathered in groups on the sidewalk, especially near the entrances of the noisy, sketchy bars on the basement floors. From one of these basements, a loud racket, sounds of singing, a guitar, strumming, and well drunken shouts poured out into the street. A crowd of women swarmed around the door. Some sat on the steps, others on the sidewalk, and some stood around gossiping. A drunk soldier, smoking a cigarette, walked near them in the middle of the road, cruising loudly, cursing loudly. He seemed to be trying to get somewhere, but had completely forgotten where he was going. One beggar was screaming at another, and a completely blacked out drunk man was lying directly across the road. Raskolnikov joined the crowd of women who were talking in hoarse, raspy voices. They had no heads and wore cheap cotton dresses and worn out shoes. Some were 40 years old. Others were no older than 17. Almost all of them had black eyes from fights. He felt a bizarre attraction to the singing, the noise, and the chaos coming from the basement bar. Inside, you could hear someone dancing wildly, stomping at their heels to the sound of guitar, and a thin, high voice singing a cheerful tune. He listened closely, feeling gloomy and lost in thought, bending down at the entrance to peer inquisitively inside from the sidewalk. Now, singer in the bar, trilling a high voice. Oh, my handsome soldier boy, don't beat me for no reason. Raskolnikov felt a desperate desire to understand the lyrics, as if his entire life depended on hearing that song. Now, Raskolnikov, thinking to himself, should I go inside? They're laughing because of the alcohol. Should I get drunk too? Now, the young woman in the crowd asking him, aren't you coming in? Her voice was still pretty and not as raspy as the others. She was young and actually decent looking, the only one in the whole group who was. Now Raskolnikov staring up and staring at her. Hey, you're actually pretty. She smiled, clearly flattered by the compliment. Young woman in the crowd now. You're pretty good looking yourself. Older woman in the crowd, interjecting in a deep, heavy voice. Look how skinny he is. Though, you just escaped from a hospital. Now, drunk peasant wearing a loose coat, smiling slyly. They all act like generals' daughters, but they have all got flat noses. Look how rowdy they are. A woman. Get lost. Drunk peasant. I'm going, sweetie. And he stumbled down into the basement bar. Raskolnikov started walking away. Young woman in the crowd shouting after him. Hey, sir, wait. Raskolnikov. What's it? She paused, acting hesitant. Now the young woman in the crowd. I would love to spend an hour with you, nice gentleman, but right now I'm embarrassed. Give me 6 kopeck for a drink. Come on, be a nice young guy. Raskolnikov reached into his pocket and handed her the first coin he touched. It was 15 kopecks. Young woman in the crowd says, Wow, what a generous gentleman. Raskolnikov, what's your name? Young woman in the crowd. Just ask for Dukleda. Bruised woman in the crowd says, shaking her head at Dukleda. Wow, that's shameful. I don't know how you can just beg like that. I think I would drop dead of embarrassment. Raskolnikov looked curiously at the woman who had just spoken. She was pockmarked, bruised woman around 30 years old with a swollen upper lip. She made a criticism quietly and completely seriously. Raskolnikov, thinking to himself, where was it? Where did I read about a man condemned to death? An hour before his execution, he thinks that if he had to live on a high, dangerous cliff, on a ledge so narrow that he only had room to stand, with nothing but the ocean, total darkness, total isolation, and endless storms around him, if he had to stand on the single square yard of space for his entire life, for 1,000 years, for eternity, it would still be better to live like that than to die right now. Just to live, to live life, no matter how horrible it is. God, how true that is. How incredibly true. Human beings are such disgusting creatures. And anyone who calls them disgusting for wanting to survive is just as disgusting. He walked into another street. Raskolnikov, thinking to himself, wait, there's the Crystal Palace restaurant. Presuming he was just talking about the Crystal Palace. What was it I wanted again? Right, the newspapers. Sosimo said he read about it in the papers. He walked into a large, surprisingly clean restaurant. It had several rooms, but they were mostly empty. 2 or 3 people were drinking tea, and even further back, 4 men were drinking champagne. Raskolnikov thought he recognized them at all, the police clerk among them, but he couldn't be sure from far away. Now Raskolnikov, thinking to himself, what if it is him? Who cares? Now the waiter, would you like some vodka, sir? Raskolnikov, give me some tea and bring me the newspapers, the old ones from the last 5 days. It should be well. The waiter, yes, sir. Here is today's paper. No vodka then? The waiter brought the old newspapers and the tea. Raskolnikov sat down and started flipping through them. Now, Raskolnikov, muttering to himself, ah, damn it, these are just gossip columns. An accident on a staircase, a shopkeeper catching fire from drinking too much alcohol, a fire in the Pesky district, a fire in the Petersburg quarter, another fire in the Petersburg quarter, and another fire there. Ah, here he is. He finally found what he was hunting for and began to read. The text blurred and danced before his eyes, but he read every word and eagerly searched the later editions for updates. His hands shook with intense, nervous anxiety as he turned the pages. Suddenly, someone sat down right next to him at his table. He looked up. It was Zamato, the head police clerk. He looked exactly the same as always, wearing his flashy rings and chain, watch chain, his curly black hair neatly parted and greased, wearing a stylish vest but a slightly cheap coat and questionable undershirt. He was in a great mood, smiling widely and cheerfully. His dark face was flushed from the champagne he had been drinking. Now Zamido, surprised, speaking familiarly as if they were lifelong friends. What? You're here? Resume told me just yesterday that you were completely unconscious. That's so bizarre. You know, I actually came to your room to visit you. Raskolnikov had known Zanikov would approach him. So he set the papers down and turned toward the clerk. There was a fake smile on his lips, hiding a sharp, irritated impatience. Raskolnikov, I know you did. I heard about it. You were looking around for my son, and you know Razumin is totally obsessed with you now. He says you took him to the Louis Ivanovna house. You know, that woman you tried to help out. The one you tried to signal the angry, explosive lieutenant about. But he didn't get the hint, remember? How good him is it? It was totally obvious, wasn't it? Now examine him. Man, he's such a hothead. Raskolnikov. Who? The explosive lieutenant? Zamedov. No, your friend Razumihin. Raskolnikov. You must have a great life, Mr. Zamedov. Free entry into all the most exclusive, shady spots. Who's been buying you champagne just now? Zamedov. We're just having a drink together. What do you mean? Buying it from me? Raskolnikov, laughing mockingly. Think of it as a bribe. You profit half of everything. It's fine, my dear boy. I'm not saying it to be mean, just as a joke, in a friendly way, just for sport. As that, sorry, as that worker of yours said when he was wrestling with Dmitri during the investigation about the old woman. Zamino, taken aback. How do you know about that? Raskolnikov. Maybe I know a lot more than about it than you do. Maybe I know a lot more about it than you do. Zamino, you are acting so strange. And positive you are still very sick. You shouldn't have left your room. Raskolnikov. Oh, really? I seem strange to you? Zamino. Yes, what are you even doing? Reading the papers? Raskolnikov. Yes. Zamiro. There's a lot of news about the fires. Now Raskolnikov looking mysteriously at Zamiro with a twisted, mocking smile. No, I'm not reading about the fires. Winking at him. No, not the fires, but admit it, my dear friend. You're trying to know what I'm reading about, aren't you? Zamiro. I don't care at all. I don't care at all. Care at all. I just ask a simple question? Why do you keep acting like this? Raskolnikov. Listen, you consider yourself an educated cultured man, right? Samuel with pride. I finished the sixth class at the academy. Raskolnikov. The sixth class? Look at you. You little bird with your neat hair part and your fancy rings. You're a wealthy gentleman now. Wow, what a charming boy. Raskolnikov burst into a well nervous laugh right in Zamidov's face. Zamidov leaned back, more completely shocked than insulted. Now Zamidov very seriously. Wow, you're so incredibly strange. I really think you are still suffering from a fever, delirium. Raskolnikov, I'm delirious? You lying, you little bird. So I'm strange, huh? You find me fascinating, do you? Zamir, yes, fascinating. Raskolnikov, should I tell you exactly what I was reading about, what I was hunting for? Look how many newspapers I made them bring me. Looks suspicious, doesn't it? Zamiro, well, what is it then? Raskolnikov, are you listening closely now? Zamidov, what do you mean listening closely? Raskolnikov, I'll explain that later, but right now, my boy, I'm declaring to you. No, let's say I confess. No, that's not the right word either. Let's say I'm giving an official statement and you are writing it down. I state that I was reading, hunting, and searching, squinting his eyes and pausing. I was searching and I came to this restaurant specifically to do it for the news about the murder of the old pawnbroker woman. Raskolnikov whispered the last words, leaning his face incredibly close to Zamitov's. Zamitov stared right back at him, frozen, not pulling away. What creeped Zamitov out the most later on was that a dead silence lasted for a full minute while they just stared into each other's eyes. Zamitov finally crying out in confusion and annoyance. So what if you're reading about it? That has nothing to do with me. What about it? Raskolnikov continuing to whisper, completely ignoring Zamitov's outburst. The exact same old woman whom you were all talking about at the police station, remember? The time I fainted. Well, you get it now? Zamitov almost panicked. What are you talking about? Get what? Raskolnikov's tense, dead serious face suddenly shifted, and he burst right into the same wild, uncontrollable laughter. In that exact fraction of a second, a memory hit him with terrifying clarity. The moment he stood behind the door, holding the axe, listening to the door latch shake while the men outside cursed and tried to force it open. He remembered the overwhelming urge he had felt back then to scream at them, curse at them, stick his tongue out, mock them, and just laugh and laugh and laugh. Zamidov now, stunned by a sudden terrifying thought. You are either completely insane or. Zamidov stopped talking, paralyzed by the realization hitting his brain. Raskolnikov, or what? What is it? Come on, tell me. Samuel, getting angry. Nothing. It's all absolute nonsense. Both of them went dead silent. Right after a sudden burst of laughter, Raskolnikov instantly became quiet, depressed, and brooding. He put his elbow on the table and rested his head in his hand. He seemed to completely forget that Zamito was even sitting there. The heavy silence stretched on for a while. Zamito, why aren't you drinking your tea? It's getting cold. Raskolnikov, what? Tea? Oh, right. Raskolnikov took a sip from the glass, ate a small piece of bread, and suddenly looked at Zamito. He seemed to remember where he was and forced himself to snap out of it. Instantly, his face went back to the same mocking, arrogant expression. He continued sipping his tea. Zamito, there have been so many of these horrible crimes lately. Just the other day, I read in the Moscow news that an entire ring of counterfeiters was busted in Moscow. It was a massive operation. They were forging bank vouchers. Raskolnikov calmly. Oh, that's all news. I read about that a month ago. So you think they are actual criminals? Smiling. So you think that they are actual criminals? Samuel. Of course they are criminals. Raskolnikov. Them? They aren't criminals. They are just childish idiots. Think about it. 50 people meeting up for a conspiracy. What a terrible idea. Even three people are too many to keep a secret because you have to trust those other people more than you trust yourself. All it takes is for one guy to get drunk and mouth off, and the whole thing collapses. Idiots. They had sketchy, untrustworthy people to cash the fake notes. Imagine trusting a complete stranger with that. Let's pretend this idiot actually succeeded and made 1,000,000 rubles each. What happens next? For the rest of their lives, every single one of them is trapped depending on the silence of the others. You might as well hang yourself immediately. Plus, They didn't even know how to properly cash the notes. The guy who went to cash them, took 5,000 rubles, and his hands were shaking so bad that he counted the first 4,000 but didn't even count the last 1,000. He was in such a desperate rush to show the cash in his pocket and sprint out the door. Obviously, he looked suspicious. The entire operation crashed because of one single idiot. Is that even believable? Xavier, that his hands were shaking, yeah, that's completely believable. I'm positive that happens. Sometimes the psychological pressure is just too much to handle. Raskolnikov, too much to handle. Zamidov, well, could you handle it? No way could I. To face that kind of pure terror just for 100 rubles, to walk into a bank with fake money when it's literally the clerk's entire job to catch people like you. No, I wouldn't have the guts to do it. Would you? Raskolnikov felt that intense, crazy urge to stick his tongue out at Zamidov again. Chills kept running down his spine. Raskolnikov, I would do it completely differently. This is how I would catch the notes. I'd count the first 1,000 3 or 4 times back and forth, staring closely at every single bill. Then I would start on the second 1,000. I'd count it halfway though through, stop, hold for a 50 ruble note up to the light, flip it over, and stare at it under the light again. Okay, wait 20 seconds. Look right there. Okay, pretty much. I would count it halfway through, stop, hold a 50 ruble note up to the light, flip it over, and stare at it under the light again to double check if it was real. I would tell them I'm paranoid because a relative of mine lost 25 rubles last week to a fake bill. And then I would tell them a whole detailed story about it. Then, after I started counting the third 1,000, I would stop and say, "Oh, wait, excuse me. I think I made a mistake around the seventh hundred bills back in the second 1,000. I'm not sure." So I'd abandon the third 1,000, go all the way back to recounting the second 1,000, and do that until the very end. When I was finally done, I'd pull one random bill from the fifth 1,000 and one from the second, hold them up to the light again, and ask, "Could you swap these out for different ones, please?" I would stress the bank clerk out so badly that he would do anything just to get rid of me. Then, after I finally finished and walked out of the door, I would turn around and come right back in. "Oh, sorry, one more question," and ask for an explanation. That is how I would do it. Zamido laughed. "Ah, the things you say are terrifying, but that's all just empty talk. I bet if you actually had to do it, you'd screw up. I believe that even a hardened, desperate professional criminal can't always control his nerves, let alone you and me. Take a local example, that old woman who was murdered in our district. The killer seemed like a reckless, desperate guy who risked everything in broad daylight and survived by a miracle. But his hands were shaking too. He didn't even manage to properly rope the place because he couldn't handle the pressure. That was incredibly obvious from the Raskolnikov looked deeply offended, and now here I ended the first part of this Crime and Punishment, Chapter 7 for Part 2, and now I'm gonna read the second part of this chapter tomorrow. And the screen.